from Tora Kukri. This is part 4 of my reply to Matt Easton's video on Gurkha and Kukri, and you'll be pleased to know it's the final part as well. Now, at 2:12, you talk about those Kukri in your video of being 18th century. That seems to me a massive assumption, because that style of Kukri is made up to and including the 20th century. So how you came to that conclusion, I do not know. And then you say they maybe bring backs from the Anglo-Nepali War. So which is it? It's the 19th century or the 18th century? And the Anglo-Nepali War was, of course, 1814 to 1816. Now, what 18th century Kukri have you actually handled? That I would be very interested to know, that you have provenance for being the 18th century. Because as far as I'm aware, no English collector has any Kukri from the 18th century. Now that takes us to, when was the first incursion to Nepal? Because you say about bringbacks from our incursions or our wars with Nepal in the 18th century. Well, there was only one incursion, and that was Captain Kinloch in 1767. And there weren't English troops involved, English officers, but not English troops. And it was an absolute disaster, not because Kinloch made some horrendous decisions militarily, but because of the conditions. And they actually did defeat the Gurkhas, although in Nepal they have it the other way around, at Sinawali. And that and that was where, in fact, 80 Gurkhas held off Kinloch's army of 2,400 men, of which were Indian sepoys, not, as I say, British troops, as I mentioned before. So I don't know where these bringbacks from the 18th century wars would have come from. Do you? Unfortunately, Kinloch caught, it appears anyway, that he caught malaria, a very bad form of malaria, in the Terai when he was going through, and only a year later he died of this reoccurring malaria. So that was very unfortunate for him. But that was our first incursion, 1767, not English troops, not Welsh troops, not Scottish troops, but Indian sepoy troops. Nothing wrong with that. Indian sepoys were fine troops indeed. But you would associate bringbacks coming back with English troops rather than Indian sepoys. But they didn't have a chance anyway to bring back anything. They were so malnourished and in such bad condition when they came back up. I think the last thing they were thinking of doing was bringing back any trophies. Now, of course, the second time we went into Nepal was with Colonel Kirkpatrick. He was a captain at that point, but that was a trade mission and also a sort of buffer against the Chinese incursion into Nepal. Now, he and Kinloch actually do talk about Kukri a little bit, and Kinloch says they have likewise a knife which they wear in their cummerbund, something in the form of a billhook with which they chop off hands and cut off noses, ears and lips, a work they seem very dexterous in. Not very nice, is it? But Colonel Kirkpatrick says it is in felling trees or shrubs and lopping off branches of others for this purpose that the dagger or the knife worn by every Nepalian and called a kukri is chiefly employed. It is also of very great use, as I repeatedly experienced in clearing away the road when obstructed by low hanging boughs of trees and other similar impediments. So there was no incursion really with which a kukri could have come back from a battle in the 18th century, not at all. Now, the first time that would have happened, of course, would have been the Anglo-Nepali War in 1814 to 1816. And that was at the Battle, really, of Kalunga on Nalipani. And Kalunga Fort was really a glorified stockade. It wasn't a fort as we think of a fort today. Well, certainly not the sort of fort you would get in the British Isles from that period. Now, the British and Indian survivors from the attack there, the initial attacks anyway, say that many have been chopped down by a hook-like knife, in brackets the kukri, possibly an agricultural implement. Well, that obviously is this style of kukri here. And you can see why they might think it's an agricultural implement. It's It's a bit like a sickle, really. And it wouldn't surprise me, actually, if the women that were involved at Kalunga did use sickles as well. And it's still a very popular tool in Nepal today. And Gillespie's force, by the way, was comprised of the 1st Battalion, King's 53rd Regiment of Foot, and the 8th Dragoons and a detachment of Royal Horse Artillery. Now, the 8th Dragoons got a bit ahead of themselves when they were attacking Kalunga, and they came across the Gurkhas in hand-to-hand combat. And literally within a few minutes, the 8th Dragoons suffered 62 casualties, wounded and dead. And what one of them has to say is quite interesting. One of the Dragoons that survived had to say was this: there was no end to the damn pot lid. No getting over or under or around about it. And he's talking about the shield. Because back then, the Gurkhas used the shield in conjunction with the kukri, and they called it a dal, which is D-H-A-L. So they would have it at the front, and they would use the kukri. They deflected the Dragoon's 1796 light cavalry sabre with it, which is a favourite sabre of mine, as I'm sure quite a few of you know, that know me anyway. And they just could not get around it, and they were very badly mauled by the Gurkhas at Kalunga. Now, at 140, you show a kukri, and you say it's probably the 19th century. Well, actually, Matt, that's a 20th century kukri. And if you look at the butt plate, the butt plate will give you an indication of when that kukri was made. So the style of butt plate is an indicator of when that kukri was made, but it's definitely a 20th century kukri. At 320, you talk about the cowdy. I agree with you. The cowdy, nobody seems to know what the cowdy was originally used for, and I've come across many different things, versions of what it means in Nepal. But I think I'm going to go with the Brigade of Gurkhas, and they did a video, I think it was around 1999, 1998, and in that they say that the cowdy that the Gurkhas use today, which is very similar to this cowdy here, or notch, or whatever you want to call it, is a representation of the Hindu Trinity, Brahma, Vishnu and Shiva. So I'm happy with that. It's as good as any an explanation there is. However, there is an exception, and there are a few other exceptions as well. This one here of the Mark 1, which belonged to the 2nd 8th Gurkha Rifles, this is a stupa, Buddhist stupa. So there are variations to it, but the original meaning, I agree, we completely lost the original meaning behind it. But I wouldn't be surprised actually if it was the Hindu Trinity for the standard cowdy, like that one there. At 606, you mention about the coppice. I agree. I don't think the kukri derives from the coppice at all, with current archaeological evidence. Who knows, in the future somebody might dig up a link from the coppice to the kukri, but from my sort of looking into it and talking to the museum curators, the National Museum in Kathmandu, the Army Museum in Kathmandu, etc., and to renowned experts of the culture of Nepal, then I think it's an indigenous blade. I don't think it came from anywhere else. You talk about it possibly coming from India, and something that Rawson has mentioned in his book, but you've got to keep in mind that Rawson never went to Nepal. So any information he's got about the kukri is probably at best second, third hand, possibly even fourth hand. And also keep in mind that in accounts of the battles and the British forces gradually taking over India, the first time the kukri is made, or this crooked knife is mentioned, is to do with Nepal. It's not mentioned anywhere else that I've come across. If you come across it being mentioned earlier, hats off to you, but I've not come across it, and I really do believe it's an indigenous blade to Nepal. Now, Egerton's book, Egerton of Tatton, It's really just a book that he did for his display. Now, he never went to India, let alone Nepal. So again, his information is going to be second, third, fourth, maybe even fifth hand as far as we know. I mean, they're a wonderful catalogue. It's a wonderful catalogue, though. I did enjoy reading it and looking through it. And many years ago, I had it as a reference, but I don't anymore because he simply never went to India, never went to Nepal, but he had a wonderful collection. I think all of us would be envious of his collection, or wouldn't mind one anyway. Now, the Tora Hilted Kukri. It's an interesting one. The Sikhs were the ones that adopted that predominantly. In Nepal, what I think has happened here is that their Tolwa sword broke and the handle on their kukri had become useless. So they took the Tolwa handle, welded it onto the kukri. 9 times out of 10, I think that is what happened. There's a kukri in the Gurkha Museum in Pokhara, and that is exactly how it looks. And in fact, most of the Tolwa hilted style kukri that I've come across in Nepal are added to the original kukri, so they are not original to the kukri. So I think I can't be 100% sure, but I think that it was a case of this one was broken, this one was broken, let's put them together, and often just welded together, to be honest with you. I wouldn't be surprised if some were made like that with very, very high cost, but there's no real evidence to suggest that is the case yet. Right, at 1135, the kukri you have on there, that's earlier than World War II. Now you talk about the handles on the old, what I call Gurkha kukri, being there so that, it doesn't slide off. No, that's rubbish, I'm afraid. All the old ones I've got had flared handles, and I think you'll find that yours were originally flared handles but have been chipped and then rounded off over time. There's another one, flared handle, and this one you can see has been slightly rounded off, but originally I think the flare came to about here because it's snapped off there and it's snapped off a bit there. But they're fantastic kukri to use. They're great fighting kukri, it must be said. Now, if the Gurkhas or the Nepalese want to chop down a large tree, they're going to use an axe. I've seen it time and time again in Nepal, and even actually they use them for logs and stuff like that as well. Again, I've seen that time and time again in Nepal. A kukri can be used to cut down a small tree if needed, but they wouldn't do it voluntarily. In other words, they're out in the jungle or on some sort of mission somewhere where there's forests and they needed to make a shelter. Sure, they'd use their kukri if they didn't have axes. But there's a great couple of pictures from the Abor expedition where you have the one Gurkha using his axe on a tree and another Gurkha not whittling away but chopping down a stake, the edge of the bottom of a stake to make it proportional to what they want to use it for. Now, early issued kukri, up until the 20th century, they did not have butt plates. At some point in the 20th century, they started to be peened over on the tang, and that was usually done with something like a washer actually, and then eventually they had a butt plate, but that wasn't a peened butt plate, that was a butt plate with screws in it, and the butt plate was there purely to protect this bit here. The first stick tang that were attached actually were the military-wise anyway, were the Mark 1s, and that was a sunken nut into the handle. Fabulous blades, mind you, love them. Great blades, Mark 1s. And then afterwards, a progression of types of peen tangs were done from like the bubble ones where you had pins or screws going either side of the peen tang. Later on, the diamond-shaped peen tangs or the Darjeeling sunburst attachment as well. Interesting actually, there's Enfield Kukri from World War One, and they have the Diamond Keeper. I often wonder if that wasn't the start of the Diamond Keeper being used on kukri in general. You talked about your military kukri being full tang, and that's a sign of the military kukri. Well, that's not necessarily true. I mean, most military kukri were stick tang, and certainly from some point in the 20th century they were peened stick tang. They were not they were not full tang, but there were full tang ones. And the Mark II you show is the M43 version. There's a problem with that particular kukri, and that is that the rivets didn't have the brass around the rivet to protect it and to stop it moving. Generally speaking, the M43 Mark IIs were actually very well made indeed. Anyway, that's where I'd like to end it. Just in future though, Matt, please remember that when you wish somebody to be left for dead in the gutter like Jacob Rees-Mogg, he has a family, he has a wife. And people like myself that you try to defame as being a racist, I have a family, I have a wife, I have kids, as does Jacob Rees-Mogg. So just think about what you're saying in the future. That would be much appreciated. Thank you very much. I hope you guys enjoyed watching the video. It's the last one about Matt's video. I'm sure you'll be pleased to hear. And do take care of yourselves. Thank you very much.